I Can Never Sleep Well in Hotels, written by The Karma Kid. For whatever reason, sleep always evades me in hotel rooms. More so than usual. Insomnia and I are old friends. I used to think that it was a side effect of my depression until recently. For years, I would stare up at the ceiling, not wanting to give in to this ailment, and I would scroll through various apps or read a book until I drifted away into my subconscious. Nowadays, I just smoke a little herb and my friend Insomnia takes the night off. That's probably why I can never sleep well in hotels. I don't usually smoke unless I'm in the comfort of my own home. Most nights where I have to stay in a hotel are forgettable and dull. But this particular night, I'll never forget. My girlfriend was graduating from San Jose State University. She had obtained a bachelor's degree in recreation, and we had just packed up her dorm and were staying in a nearby hotel with some of her family. Her parents had paid for their room and our room as well. We were going to stay for a couple of nights so that we could go back to the dorms and clean up a little before checkout. Our room consisted of my girlfriend, Sarah, her sister, Valerie, Valerie's daughter, Neva, and myself. It was the last night of staying at the hotel, and Sarah's parents had already left earlier in the day in an attempt to beat the weekend traffic out of San Jose. It was around 12:30 a.m. when I decided to go for a walk down the halls and do some exploring, a common late-night activity that I was known for doing prior to turning to cannabis. I quickly tied my shoes and put in my earbuds as I began to walk about the hotel. I kept to myself as it was late and I did not want to disturb any of the other guests who were attempting to sleep. That is, if they weren't like me. I padded down a flight of stairs from the second floor, where my room was located, to the first floor, watching my feet as I went, as I always do. When out of the corner of my eye and through the railing, I see a tall man in a top hat silently walk down the hallway and out of view. I didn't catch a good view of him, so I really don't have a good description. My focus was on the stairs, as I'm quite clumsy and the stairs were somewhat steep and carpeted. I rounded the banister and I peered down the hallway to see if I could catch a glimpse of the top hat man, but I saw nothing. Had I imagined it? Was it some trick of the light, or did a man in a top hat really pass by the staircase? I shrugged it off, and I assumed that if there really had been a top hat man, he had probably slipped into his room before I had rounded the corner to see him, and I went on my way. Music still playing softly in my ears. I remembered earlier that day seeing a patio with a comfortable-looking seating area by the pool outside, and I decided that that's where I would head. As I made my way towards the exit, I felt strange. Like I was being watched, or as if I wasn't alone in the hallways. I stopped at the door with my hands on the push bar and I turned around, half expecting Top Hat Man to be holding something sinister like something out of a horror movie. But when I turned around, I saw nothing. Once again, I shrugged it off and I continued out the door. Once I arrived at the patio area and was seated rather comfortably in a large wicker chair facing the street, I took out my earbuds and I listened to the nightlife, letting the sounds of the city past midnight wash over me. A slight breeze occasionally rattled the chain-link fence in front of me. Time seemed to lapse because what felt like 30 minutes passing by had really almost been an hour and a half. I looked and saw my phone screen reading 1:55 a.m., and I decided that I needed to head back to the room and attempt to get some sleep. Just before I put my earbuds back in, that feeling washed over me again. And this time I heard whispering. It was almost as if someone was standing on the other side of the fence, speaking in hushed tones to a friend. Although this whispering wasn't coming from in front of me, it came from behind me. The little voice in my head told me not to turn around, but I had to. Once again, I expected the Top Hat Man for whatever reason. Though, when I turned around, there was nothing, and the whispering stopped immediately. The sounds of a restless city played on all around me, and I let out a breath that I didn't realize I was holding. I shook my head and chuckled to myself. I really need to lay off the horror films, I thought to myself, as I proceeded to place my earbuds back in my ears. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glint in the window. I looked up out of instinct, and there he was. The Top Hat Man. It was brief, but I saw him in a window on the second floor. He must have been tall because he was almost the same height as the window itself, which I estimated to be at least 8 feet tall. He was slender, and while I couldn't make out much, I could tell that he had long fingers. I could tell that he had long fingers because his hand was placed flat on the glass. But, as I said before, I only caught a glimpse of him. He was quickly gone from the window, and I was left alone, standing in the patio area, all by myself with no one in sight. I decided that earbuds weren't the best idea as I gathered up my courage to go back to my room. Upon arrival at my hotel room door, I stopped and I took a breath. My right hand was on the doorknob and my keycard was in my left. The walk back to the room had been uneventful, and I was relieved for that. So many thoughts ran through my head that it was hard to keep track of all of them. It could have just been some creepy old man playing a trick on a fellow insomniac. He must have seen me descending the stairs and decided then to have a bit of fun. He could have easily slipped down an intersecting hallway and stood still for a moment after I first saw him, and then followed me to the door before pulling the same trick there. Afterwards, he probably went up to his room on the second floor and noticed me on the patio and couldn't resist the temptation. He was probably standing on a chair or something to give him the apparent height he had in the window before he jumped off into the shadows to disappear. But then again, I shook my head and I cleared my thoughts. I was probably just seeing things on account of the lack of decent sleep. I swiped the keycard and I opened the door. The room was unusually lit as I closed the door. After setting the card gently on the dresser so as to not wake up the others, I noticed where the light was coming from. The curtains were drawn back and the moonlight shone through the window. I don't remember that being open, I thought to myself as I silently walked over to the window to close the curtains. Just as I was about to close them, I noticed that our window looked out over the patio. In fact, it was one of only 2 windows that overlooked the patio. The dawning realization that the Top Hat Man had been in my room with Sarah and the others watching me from my window washed over me. I instantly began to panic. Just then, I caught a glimpse of a figure in the window and instantly knew that it was the Top Hat Man. It had to be. I spun around, only to find a half-awake Sarah standing barefoot at the end of our bed, rubbing her eyes. "What are you doing, you lunatic? It's 2:15 in the morning. Why are you opening the curtains?" she whispered. I knew that she wasn't awake enough to understand the full story. Heck, I wasn't even sure there was a story to tell. I closed the curtains behind me and I walked over to her, careful not to alarm her in the process. I gave it my best shot at persuasion as I glanced around the room looking for any other sign of the Top Hat Man having been there. All the while I fed the half-awake Sarah a lie about hearing a bird outside the window. She bought it with no problem and stumbled back into bed as I hastily checked the room again. There was nothing. We were all safe. After all the excitement, I was sure that I wasn't going to be able to get to sleep, but I actually began to drift off rather quickly. That is, until I heard the whispers again. I opened my eyes, and there he was. Only this time, his back was to me, and he stood at the edge of Valerie and Neva's bed, watching them sleep as whispers emanated from him. I had never experienced sleep paralysis until that night, and I've never experienced it since. But I can say with all honesty, that sleep paralysis is the scariest thing that I have ever had the misfortune of experiencing in my entire life. My mother says that sleep paralysis is just your body waking up while your astral form is still wandering about. I don't know how much of that I actually believe, but I was frozen, laying on my side facing Sarah, who was on her back with her right arm stretched out towards me. I had at some point laid my right hand on her wrist because it remained there. Try as I might, I couldn't move. My breathing began to pick up and I tried everything that I could. The only thing that I could do was squeeze Sarah's arm, so I did. I squeezed her arm as hard as I could in an attempt to wake her up so that she could help me get moving, but it was all in vain. As I squeezed, Sarah began to stir, but only to pull her arm away from my grasp. She rested it back on the bed, inches from my fingertips. The sound of my arm hitting the bed must have gotten the top hat man's attention, because at that, he straightened up and slowly turned around. Panic coursed through my veins. Once he was turned around completely, he glided over to Sarah's side of the bed at an agonizing pace. I had never felt so sick in my life. My stomach clenched. Tears ran down my face. Any attempt at movement failed, all except for my right hand, which I clenched into a fist, bunching up the sheet within it. The whispers grew louder and I tried to speak, but my mouth would not move, and no sound escaped my throat. I could only sit in silence and watch as the top hat man slowly bent down over Sarah. He raised a single hand in a wide arc, closing each unnaturally long finger on his hand painfully slow, until only his index finger remained, bony and frail. He crept closer and closer to Sarah as she remained fast asleep. He eventually was hovering over her abdomen. My vision began to blur as tears poured violently down my cheeks. I shook with such immense fear that the bed began to shake as well. The whispers grew louder still as another presence appeared out of thin air directly behind me. I could feel the breath on my neck, which made the hairs there stand on edge. A single hand, identical to that of the top hat man's, hovered over my face and wiped a tear from streaming down my face with a single finger. Its skin felt leathery and it smelled like death. Just as the top hat man was about to touch Sarah's stomach, the hand reached over and placed 2 fingers over my eyelids, closing them as a coroner would do to a corpse. As soon as they closed, the pressure on my body was released and I bolted upright, grabbing Sarah by the belly and frantically looking around the room. She only slightly stirred again, this time to roll over on her side and grumble something inaudible. Once again, there was no sign of the top hat man. 2 weeks later, we found out that Sarah was pregnant, 8 weeks along. To this day, I still catch glimpses of him. I even hear the whispers. But nothing like that night.